podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
This episode is brought to you by Onnit. You know when you're so into what you're doing that you can't think about anything else? Feel that kind of focus every day with Alpha Brain. Its clinically studied nootropic ingredients support memory, mental speed, and flow state, that in-the-zone feeling. Alpha Brain is available as capsules, powder, or a ready-to-drink shot. And for extreme situations, there's Alpha Brain Black Label. Use code SPOTIFY to save cash. Learn more at onnit.com.
With the biggest ever Women's European Football Championship due to start this week, we bring you an exclusive interview with Rebecca Salden, a women's football sponsorship expert. She shares her insights from previous tournaments and she explains exactly how this year's Euros will be the biggest women's football tournament yet.
Hello and welcome to Lesson 2 of Series 2 of 21 for 21. Podcast all about everything going on in the sport media world. The biggest thing in the sport media world right now, of course, is the Women's Euros, which is set to kick off on Wednesday, 6th of July, hosted in England. Very quickly, we'll get into this. But my name is Jamie Coles. I'm in Barcelona. I'm joined as ever by Stuart Levy. Stuart, how are you doing?
Yeah, all good. We've mentioned in our episode before, you're in Barcelona. I'm in Dusseldorf, but this is one week where maybe we both wish we were back in England, such as the hype and the excitement about the Women's Euros that's just about to get started.
Absolutely. I've been following, of course, European women's football for the last couple of seasons quite closely, working with Barca. Now we've got an international stage. Spain are set to be favourites. 9 Barca players called up for Spain, but I think the ones to watch are the Lionesses, England at home.
I think
some
with
big names in that team.
For a home tournament, you're right, with even more established names like, of course, with their traditional captain, Steph Houghton, not even being, though she's had some injury issues, but she's fit and she's been left out, as is the strength and depth for Sabrina Wiegman and her Lionesses. So no, it'll be a great festival of football for us to watch. It's on obviously all the main TV channels here in Germany, and I guess in Spain it's got a really good broadcasting deal as well.
Yeah, absolutely. All the Spain matches are on free to view national TV.
Right.
So that was certainly a big thing here, and I imagine in other countries, with this kind of boom we're seeing in women's football, we'll see something similar. Yeah,
I mean, the previous Women's Euros was 5 years ago. Obviously, this year's been delayed 1 year due to the pandemic. But in the Netherlands, there was record attendances and record tickets sold. And in England, they hope to double that. There may have been some issues about not the very biggest stadiums being selected, but I think full stadiums in smaller venues maybe looks for a better atmosphere than slightly more people but emptier big stadiums. But no, I think what's interesting about my chat with Rebecca, who's a women's sports sponsorship expert, and I'm sure she's really experienced, sharing her knowledge of the women's game. She's explaining exactly what might be different about this, because in previous Women's World Cups there's been maybe people who watch the big games and then it drops off, but she really thinks that the time is now for women's sports, that post the Euros, the interest is here to stay. And this is a really interesting idea she shares with me, which are coming up in the episode.
Yeah, so maybe we shouldn't beat around the bush too much there, as it were, and get straight into it. So earlier this week, Stuart spoke with Rebecca Salden, as you've said, deals with the sponsorship side of things, which is kind of an interesting side of things. We talk quite a lot about media rights and broadcast rights as well. I do feel like this is one of those competitions that there's a lot of excitement around it in various different areas, and we could talk about all sorts of different things, let alone the football itself.
Yeah, another interesting one is TikTok. We touched on it before in our episodes, how they're continuing their sponsorship from the men's Euros into the women's Euros. And she also shared a really cool example from Budweiser and how they have previously activated their agreement with the US women's team. So again, not directly linked to the Euros, but still a really cool example of how women's sport doesn't have to follow what the men's sport did 10 years ago. It can and possibly should create its own path.
Brilliant. So without further ado then, let's have a listen to the interview that Stuart did earlier this week with Rebecca Soden.
So I'm joined now by Rebecca Soden, who is, as well as a former international player, she is the founder of Team Heroin. Rebecca, thank you for joining us.
Great to be here, and I'm really excited to talk about all the football action in women's world that's coming up.
Yeah, definitely. So, of course, we're mainly going to talk about the upcoming Women's Euros, which we'll get to later. But this is, as we've touched on before, this has been a huge year for women's sport and women's football in particular already.
Yeah, it's been record-breaking moments throughout the year. Obviously, in terms of football, the Women's Champions League was a huge success. You know, I think week after week for about a month there, we were hearing about record-breaking crowds. And I was fortunate enough to be at the Barcelona versus Wolfsburg game at Camp Nou in Barcelona. And the atmosphere and experience was just one of the best things I've ever experienced. And you could just feel the sense of pride at breaking these records and this new movement to support women's football. So it felt like not just a one-off, but a real movement and kind of setting the tone moving forward. Obviously, you know, there's so much activity happening with Euros coming up, the Com Games, the first Tour de Femmes ever. So it's a really exciting time in women's sport, particularly women's football, with some huge events and some great records and performances this year already.
Yeah, so your company then, so you're involved in the sponsorship and the marketing of some of these events, or are you working more with the athletes? So how's an average day for Rebecca?
Yes, so Team Heron came about 2 years ago, really. I was watching the FIFA Women's World Cup in France, and, you know, along with a billion other people, and just the excitement and the opportunity around that. And I still couldn't believe that more sponsors hadn't clued on to how big women's sport was becoming and the opportunity around it. And those that were involved or sponsoring seemed to be doing a copy and paste job of their men's sponsorships, or just kind of rolling out the same model for women's football, and missing huge opportunities given the different product nature of the two. So yeah, I started advocating for women's sports sponsorship, you know, some marketing, looking at best case marketing, differences between men and women's sport, and evolved into a business where I've been helping different brands, so sponsors. I was involved helping advise the team at Zero, who just announced their FIFA Women's Football sponsorship, which will include the up-and-coming World Cup and all the other tournaments. So really huge opportunity and an amazing company and brand, which I think is really going to help drive the women's football space forward. Really collaborative, get it, and engage. So that's great. And yeah, I just help a number of other brands through consulting, insights around, you know, Cricket World Cup leverage. I'm helping a number of the New Zealand football firms with brand partnerships in the lead up to the Football World Cup down in New Zealand. So yeah, I think the nature of women's sport at the moment, there's a lot of testing and learning, evaluating the opportunities. So it's a lot of, you know, different kind of job every day, which is fantastic depending on the needs.
And I'm sure a home World Cup for your successors in the New Zealand national team will be an amazing experience next year. So you touched on sort of briefly just then the differences between men's and women's sports. Can you is that in terms of maybe the different fan base or different image of the athletes, or how, just from a marketing point of view, are you sort of aiming to differentiate between the two? Because I guess you're right, at first maybe women's sports sponsorship was almost a CSR task, but now it's really showing its value independently.
Yeah, exactly. I think, yeah, you do need to treat them as different products. Obviously, men's sport has been around for decades and decades longer than women's sport. And it's always been, because it's primarily been a men's sport, and it's been viewed from a male lens, and set up in that regard. So there's all these structures and systems that kind of have helped men's sport thrive, and anything that's been inferior or different to that, what the ultimate men's sport elite is or whatever, has been secondary or inferior. However, you know, now we're kind of seeing the growth of women's sports. We need to treat it as a different product, a little bit like a startup. So of course, success doesn't happen overnight. You know, men's sport has taken 50, 60 years to get to where it is today. I think first Super Bowl, you know, had a completely empty stadium, but of course, you know, 40, 50 years later with the growth, it's now packed out. So, you know, we have to have the investment and resource behind it up front. But when I say the different products, yeah, from an audience point of view, obviously, naturally, from a playing point of view, yes, women might not be as strong or as fast as men's, but there's different opportunities in a game. People see the players as more relatable. There's research out saying people find women's sport more inspiring, more down to earth, more inclusive, very desirable attributes for a brand to align with. So from a branding point of view, it's a very different product and a different opportunity for brands to men's sport, and particularly around, I guess, when you're looking at the marketing funnel, men's sport typically at the elite level, the premiership or whatever it might be, has huge reaching eyeballs. So a lot of sponsors are still buying that space for, if they're launching a new product or trying to get awareness with that brand, because it's delivering those high reaching numbers as well, obviously, as well as the consideration and the alignment from a sponsorship. Whereas women's sport, the big opportunity I see is around that consideration part of the model. Hey, we've got these great brand values that we can align to. Let's align our brand with that and get all the positive brand rub that comes being alongside women's sport. And it's a great platform to tell those brand stories, be it, gender equality, I'm a progressive brand, forward thinking, all those different attributes that women's sports offers. As well as that for brands, we know the audience is different. So women's sport has a more even gender split. So depending on the sport, it sits around 50-50, whereas men's sport has a, 70-80% male skew. So again, huge different opportunity to pull in more female fans. When you look at household shoppers, women are going to own 80% of consumption decisions in the next 5 years. So if you're wanting to target people through their passion of sport, women's sport is a great alternative to do that. And we're seeing the brands that are backing women's sport early getting the results as well. So I know you mentioned there about CSR. It's definitely moved on from that. We're seeing research out of the States with the likes of Budweiser around the National Women's Soccer League getting twice the consideration from women's sports fans that they do with men's sports. So we know women's sports fans back brands who support women's sports. So if you want to increase your brand loyalty, women's sports is a great place to play.
Yeah, this is something that I'm sure Jamie, my co-host, he mentioned. So he sort of works a lot with Barcelona women's team, and he himself has got a really small but passionate and committed fan base who are always nagging him on Twitter for the latest news and latest updates around the team. So it is really interesting to see how the women's sport fan base is developing differently from men's did. Because again, you mentioned the Super Bowl, the men's sports team fan base has been built up over such a long period of time, and the women's sport fan base is exploding at the time of the internet and social media.
Exactly. And I think, again, going back to women's sport specific fans, they do have different fan behaviors. So we know they are more passionate about social cause. So, the WNBA, big advocates for the likes of Black Lives Matter. We see when they post or do something around that, engagement spikes. So we know that's a key component to women's sports fans. They care about social cause. In terms of their behaviors, they're very socially native because they've had to be. So again, if you're a women's sports fan and you wanted to watch your team play a game, up until particularly the last year or so, it's not been on mainstream TV. It's been hard to access. It might not have even been filmed. So you're having to find dodgy links or social media updates to get the score results, unlike men's sport, which has a bigger platform, better broadcast. So these women's sports fans have been hanging around social media and on digital and have become early adopters in this space. So again, opportunities around, innovation, being first to test things with women's sports fans, making sure when you're thinking about campaigns that, yes, they have a socially led idea behind them. So yeah, it's definitely a different product in terms of all those components, from fans to brand opportunities, to even how you leverage it. And again, I spoke about, this head start that men's sport has had. So, any person in the world could probably name 5 of the top men's football players in the world, Ronaldo, Messi, even if you're not a football or sports fan. But when it comes to women's football, of course, because they haven't had the exposure, we don't know them as well. So even as a women's football fan, I can probably only name 15 women's footballers, because again, that lack of exposure, I don't know them through the news coverage or through TV. So when we're looking to leverage that, a lot of the advice I give is, let's create personal connection with fans and these players, because that's what's going to pull new fans into the sport and into your sponsorship. So it's all about trying to grow familiarity of these players, telling their stories. So that might look like, compared to men's sport, it might be more of the logo exposure stuff. Hey, let's create some content that tells the story of one of these players, develop that emotional connection. So it's a different way of leveraging it as well.
Yes, I guess it's still the option. It still is the potential, of course, just to bump into a women's top women's sports star in the supermarket or in out and about. So I guess that's still that personal relationship. You can, the more attainable, it's more achievable to that. They're more a regular person in some ways, despite these incredible sporting ability and athletic feats.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's one of the positive attributes that brands, media need to tap into. They are more relatable. They're not on these multi-million-dollar week salaries. They are more like you and I. And, that comes across. And I think people like to see that. And, we've seen the backlash from, men's football, particularly, with the breakaway league and, is it kind of losing its roots? So I think, again, women's football is a great outlet, that it still has that nice, brand and kind of component to it that many of the top men's leagues don't have. So again, a different opportunity for brands and sponsors to get behind.
So is there a particular example of a really great marketing campaign using women's sports or women's football, either around the upcoming Euros, or I know you mentioned Budweiser before in America? Is there a particular example that you can talk about and how it worked?
Yeah, around the Euros, or just in general football. Well, I think the thing I like to see around women's sports and what I spoke to again is it's at a different stage cycle with women's sport. We need to learn the players more. It's not like men's sport where you're paying huge megabucks for a sponsorship. We need to extract as much value as possible out of it. The best place women's sports sponsors can play at the moment is, how are you going to add to the women's sport ecosystem, be it through helping the ecosystem get more investment, helping increase participation numbers, helping athlete well-being, putting marketing spend. What role can you play that will add and fuel this women's sports world to thrive? Not only is that great for women's sport, but you as the brand, I guess, look like a superhero that, hey, we're actually a genuine contributor in the space. We want to grow the game. Fans can kind of see that out. And again, if you play in this space, you're not only adding to women's sports, but you're getting the return, as we've seen out of the research, that 2 times brand loyalty. So I always encourage brands to, what can you do? And there's so many different ways you can do that in entertainment. It doesn't always have to be about the big female empowerment ads. I think the last World Cup in France, there were so many. I mean, they were great, and there were these high production, dramatic, ads and inspiring the next generation, Sarah Beer and female empowerment. And yeah, sure, that's great, but you can still go with being as effective with fun and humor and sarcasm as well. So I think that's another thing to consider as well. And I think that's why I liked the Euros Lionesses squad announcement. It was slightly different. They did a fun little play announcing the Lionesses squad. It went back to grassroots and bringing the community in and rallying the nation to support the Lionesses. But it just felt a little bit different and quirky. And hey, I'll check that out. But some of the best case examples of women's sports sponsorship I've seen is the likes of, go back to Budweiser in the States. After the FIFA Women's World Cup, every 4 years in America, women's football goes like this viewership, but when they come back, it drops off again, and you see empty crowds at the National Women's Soccer League. So Budweiser wanted to kind of make sure these big sponsors around the World Cup who were there kind of continued their support, and they wanted to drive continued investment in the game. So Budweiser created this amazing campaign called The Unofficial Sponsor, and they created kind of mock advertisements to get other categories into back the National Women's Soccer League. So they used star Megan Rapinoe. She was doing a mock deodorant ad like this. Hey, you could have your brand here. Are you a deodorant sponsor? You could be the next sponsor of the National Women's Soccer League. So they actually use their marketing sponsorship budget to encourage other brands to help the National Women's Soccer League invest in the game, great for the game. And, such a fun, quirky campaign and something so different. It got so much PR. People noticed it. Again, they got the return from fans. And the great result, they ended up getting 6 new sponsors across the league and continuing that support. So that's a great example of a brand adding to the system, but doing it in a really clever way. So I recommend checking out that campaign, Budweiser's unofficial sponsor campaign.
Stay tuned to hear all about Rebecca's predictions for what's going to happen on the field at this year's Euros after this quick break. So we mentioned, again, that was after the Women's World Cup, so 3 years ago now in France, and we've got the Women's Euros starting in a few days, could even be today, depending on when we publish the episode, but when we're talking, it's not quite yet. Even though this is just a European event, do you expect the media attention, certainly in Europe, to be larger than the World Cup was just 3 years ago?
Yeah, I think, women's sports 3 years has been huge growth. I think that World Cup in France was a tipping point for all women's sport. We saw huge viewership at that event, but it actually had a flow-on effect with all women's sports and kind of lifted the tide up. So I think, yeah, in terms of women's sports, it's moving so quickly that even 6 months different, the game can have moved on so far. So I don't think people realize how big the Euros are going to be. I think there's this real demand and appetite for live sport. There's great things. Everyone's, post-COVID world started about traveling to the games, supporting women's sport. And I think we've had the perfect run up in terms of, huge women's Super League in the UK, record viewership numbers, the quality of football is next level. It's been a new era on the field that we've seen. And I think we'll see that continue over to the Euros. Again, you look at the Women's Champions League, what that's done for football and women's sport. DAZN did a fantastic campaign there. They launched all the coverage free on YouTube and have seen some fantastic viewership numbers. But again, the football quality is something I've just never seen before. It's just next level. And again, the support, every week in the Champions League, we were hearing about record-breaking crowds. So I think it's got this perfect momentum to lead into this event. It's going to be great weather. We've got home team, the Lionesses in the UK. We know it's a massive footballing nation. So I think even the media don't quite realize how big it is going to be until we're in it, and the street's going to be alive in the UK, and it's going to be great goals, and it's just going to have this massive flow-on effect. I think too, what we're seeing out of the likes of the BBC. So we know with women's sport, free-to-air coverage is essential to growing it, to using the news clips across multiple platforms. And the BBC have just announced their comprehensive coverage. And, I'm just so impressed. They've got over 40 media experts fronting the coverage for a start. Some of the top talent, they're going to have a daily podcast. They're going to have pretty much every game free on their main BBC One and BBC Two channels. They've got a documentary with Alex Scott. Going to have highlights behind the scenes across, TikTok, YouTube. So I think, coming in, it's kind of this chicken and egg scenario. People say no one watches women's sport, but we know it has an accessibility issue. So what we're seeing out of the likes of BBC is just going to make it so much more accessible for people and drive that hype. And I think another thing I'm excited about is TikTok. They've become a really big player in women's sport. They have got behind the Six Nations rugby, Burnley FC, support Portland Thorns in the US, Extreme E, which has a big equality component to it. And they came on board as the Euros sponsor last month. And I think what that's going to do in terms of pulling in casual fans is going to be huge across the globe. They've got a massive platform and massive user base, particularly younger generation, that they can feed in little entertaining bits off the football field too, bringing that culture side. It's going to appeal to new people. They're going to get to learn the players. And then when the tournament ends, they're going to continue to follow it. And I think, they're looking to do some really creative content out of the tournament, outside of the pitch cameras that BBC will be doing, the behind the scenes, off-field stuff. So I'm really excited to see what comes out of that. But I think, we're going to see a lot of records broken. That's set to be the most viewed tournament in the UK, which I have no doubt will happen. I think it will even come close to some of those World Cup numbers, because even though it's a European event, so many countries in Europe are mad football nations, but because of the quality and the hype around women's football at the moment, it's going to appeal globally to most nations.
Yeah, the TikTok partnership during the men's Euros last summer was really interesting because, as you say, they were an official partner. So you could act out or recreate famous moments from the games because it was a fully licensed partner. So I think the TikTok account, in just 2 weeks after being created, had more followers than the Twitter account of the Euros. So it's going to be great to see that continue for the women's Euros this summer.
Definitely.
So how could this tournament be viewed as a success? Will it be just if the records are broken at the time, or will we only know that if it's a success next year, if people in Europe are setting their alarms for 2 a.m. to watch the tournament in Australia and New Zealand? How can we really judge this as being a success?
Yeah, and I think I alluded to it earlier that, in the US, they get this massive surge every World Cup. The whole nation gets behind the National Women's Soccer League, and then it kind of dies down. And we see this with major events, huge spikes in women's sport. But I think the success factor again will be ensuring when it goes up, even though it'll be a major event, the interest comes down, but to a higher level than what it was previously. So I think, it's all about that event, but maintaining the interest. So, it's about producing content that people can continue after these big spikes to be engaged with, having an always on presence. So it's like, oh, cool, keeping those casual fans interested. And again, that doesn't have to be just football content, personality driven content, storytelling that keeps people engaged. So for me, it's definitely ensuring that spike doesn't drop back to the lower levels. It's ensuring it's maintained higher, but also continuing that always on presence. I think too, it's not just about the viewership and how many people are attending. I think success for me will be more sponsors in the space. So going, wow, that was an amazing event. Look, this is what investing in women's sport as a sponsor can do, all that great coverage, and then fueling all women's sports investment and sponsorship from there. So I think for me, it'd be pulling in more sponsors, and also enticing the media. So again, media coverage only gets a fraction of coverage that men's sports gets, around 15% typically. So I think, once we get all these journalists going out to meet all the players, like the hype, the buzz, seeing that the interest is there, again, this chicken and egg scenario, that they'll go, oh, hey, I love these players. There was demand. Let's continue to cover them throughout the year in domestic competitions or other events or personal stories. So raising that 15% and keep driving it forward. So I think it's definitely a fluid continuum, and one that will be kind of judged whether it's a success.
Right. So on the field, then we'll go slightly away from the sponsorship topic. Do you have any tips, any predictions for what we're about to see in these next few weeks in England? Will the home nation win? I think they're favourites. One of the favourites, at least, I would say.
Yeah, the big questions, right? It's always hard to know. I think with major events like this, it's kind of anyone's game because, rising to the occasion, you never quite know what's going to happen in these big moments. But, I think I'd love to see, obviously, the Lionesses at home do well. And I think they're going to really get uplifted by the home crowd. So I'm hoping that they'll do well. Obviously, I'm keeping an eye on Spain. I think, the way Barcelona performed in the Champions League and some of the best players in the world at the moment, I think they're going to be a strong contender, and just the style of play at the moment is just unbelievable. And then you've got always your powerhouses, your France's, your Netherlands. But I think predictions from just an overall view, I think people don't realise quite how big this is going to be. I know there's been a lot of talk. The England games have sold out, but I think once it hits, everyone's going to get FOMO. The rest of the tickets are going to sell out. Everyone's going to come out to the fan zones, tune in. It's going to get, substantial media coverage. So I can't underestimate the impact on culture and society that the buzz is going to have. I'd encourage anyone also too to have a go on the football fantasy game around the Euros. It's the first time an official football fantasy game's been launched, and great to see again Starling Bank coming on board to do that. Again, as I spoke about, a great place for sponsors to play. They're adding to this ecosystem by enabling women's sports fans to be able to engage with the players in the game in this way, but it's going to help people further engage with women's football and learn more about the players. So it's a great development for the sport, and I think Starling Bank have done really well there. So even if you don't know all the players or have know who's going to win, I encourage everyone to get on that and just give it a go and support that development.
Yeah, I think a fantasy league is almost part of the excitement and the anticipation that we used to around sport, because certainly in the men's Premier League, the fantasy Premier League, such a huge worldwide game. So the fact that those casual fans will think, oh, Women's Euros, is there a fantasy league? And there is. It almost adds to that legitimacy, and it adds to that the scale of the event. Now, of course, it's a big event. Of course, there's a fantasy league.
Yeah, I think you touched on something there. It's that legitimacy. Every more men's competition has it, and for me, I've kind of been forced to play the men's football fantasy, and I don't have as much interest in that. So it's like, oh yeah. Whereas I'm like, yes, I can now get back on my friends who might know the women's game as well as the men's, and not finish bottom in the table. And yeah, it's just, for me, that just is so much more interesting. So I think, again, giving that type of engagement and opportunity to existing women's football fans, but as you said, pulling in new fans, the people who like the gamification side of sport, of course it's going to be fun, pull them in through that, and then become fans of the wider game.
Good. No, so I'm sure Jamie and myself will certainly be playing it against each other, and then we'll come back to it in a few podcasts time to see who is the 21 for 21.
Yeah, real competition.
Fantasy champ, definitely. So Rebecca, thank you again so much for your time. We've already had almost 21 lessons from you already, but as we always do on this podcast, we ask for just one lesson for sport and media going forward. So is there a way you could sum up everything you've talked about, or maybe something else as your lesson for sport and media?
Yeah, for me, particularly in the women's sport world, I would say don't be afraid to be bold and go in an uncharted territory. I think for women's sport, the traditional take on men's sport is not going to work. We need to fast track women's sport at a quicker rate than it's been happening. And that requires bold thinking, bold execution. So for me, it's don't be afraid to be bold and do something that hasn't already been done before, because women's sports needs it. And if it works, you're going to get the biggest rewards and stand out the most.
Great. So again, thank you for your time. Is there anywhere our listeners can find you, any social media or the Team Heron website? Where would be the best way for them to get in touch with you?
I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. So I'm always doing analysis on women's sport marketing campaigns and news. So follow me there on LinkedIn, Rebecca Sowden, Sowden, and also check out my Team Heron website, teamheron.com. You can sign up to my monthly women's sport sponsorship and marketing newsletter there to stay in the know and stay ahead of the women's sport game.
So thanks again to Rebecca for speaking with Stuart, joining us on the podcast. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to join, but it was a really interesting conversation. So yeah, thank you to you as well, Stuart, for setting that up, because it was it's nice to hear about these different sides of things ahead of these major competitions.
She definitely really knows the stuff, Rebecca. She's certainly very, very passionate, like we all are, about the sport, but her knowledge of the sponsorship industry, I learned a lot, and I hope you guys listening at home did too. Absolutely.
So thanks for joining us. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for further episodes of 21 for 21. Be sure to make sure, if you don't want to miss anything, make sure you like and subscribe, and yeah, find us on social media as well. Thanks a lot.
Sports Social Podcast Network.